I did something diabolical. I did something diabolical. I learned everything about circumcision. I know everything about it, and I'm going to tell you. Buckle up, because it's gonna be a bumpy fucking ride.
So a little while ago, I was watching Venessa Vokey get interviewed on the artist Birdy Rose's channel. I'll put the link in the description. One of the things that she brought up was this documentary on circumcision. I think he calls it a play, but it's, essentially like an elaborate TED Talk.
Hello everyone, it's Eric Clopper. You may be following my channel because of the release of my recent show at Harvard University, Sex and Circumcision, an American Love Story.
And it's pretty good. It was interesting for me because circumcision isn't as common in Australia and basically anywhere outside of the United States in the first world, except for Israel, of course, as will become important later. But it's like common enough that people who are into circumcision or people who are more used to circumcision will be grossed out by the idea of people being uncircumcised. And I want to extend a olive branch of whatever to people who think it's gross on either side, because I'll come to make an argument that I think is more convincing that the other way is gross.
Circumcision lies where surgery, sex, religion meet.
It's a powerful, compelling topic.
Most of the world is not circumcised.
Europeans have never practiced circumcision.
It's lunacy.
It definitely affects sensation.
Major claims require major proof. When you make a major claim that we doctors can improve upon the human body by removing organs, you got to show me major proof.
But I guess my point is that, for instance, it struck me when I first heard that women in countries where female genital mutilation is common think uncircumcised girls look gross. And it's yeah, of course you would, because genitals are one of those things that are kind of like ears or noses where everyone's got one, but everyone has their own particular one and they're all kind of gross. I think it's really easy to become to be grossed out about changes to things like that. And for example, I think everyone would agree that an extra foreskin on top of the pre-existing foreskin, that'd be pretty gross. We can all agree on that. So then the other people at the moment are just they like one less or one more than you currently do. But we all agree there can be too many. So it was interesting because I hadn't really thought about it before. I'd never really thought of male circumcision as being on the level of female circumcision. And he doesn't exactly make that argument, but he makes something pretty close to that. And in fact, one of the things about the presentation that I spectacularly forgot was one of the things that he says is that I'm going to make 5 points, and if I just said what the 5 points were, you'd all get up and walk out right now because of how sacrosanct, I guess, some of these ideas are. And instead, he kind of goes through one by one and gradually gets the room acclimatized to the different, quite obvious ideas. But yeah, there is this kind of cultural reflex at examining them or against examining them. And anyway, one of the points that he gets to is about the connection between circumcision as a ritual and human sacrifice. And I never actually got to that in the conversation when I was talking to people about this, because I totally didn't read the room and was oh yeah, if you guys heard about this documentary Venessa Vokey's been talking about, in the audience or in the people I was talking to were people who'd had their kids circumcised, people who'd been circumcised themselves, and a Jewish person or a person from Israel where it was 100% conformity. And yeah, I was Oh yeah, you should see this documentary. It just occurred to me that's why they're always talking about lotion when they're talking about masturbating, because they can't masturbate without it. Part of me was like, oh, this is a pretty brash or like edgy thing to say, but how I felt like going into it was like, obviously everyone thinks uncircumcised penises are gross, so I'll be seen as the like underdog punching up against the circumcision authority, and instead I just like really upset a whole bunch of people and didn't quite get to make my point, which was the greatest tragedy of all, evidently. One of the more outlandish or like outrageous points that the guy raised, which I don't know, I may have gotten to this, which shows how socially inept I am.
Yeah, I need to say I'm 100% making fun of me here, and everyone there was really polite, regardless of, and not just polite, but friendly and warm, regardless of how socially inept I was being.
But he talks about the connection between human sacrifice and circumcision, and how it's like kind of a faux human sacrifice. And in particular, he talks about how up until quite recently, and I had heard this previously, that they would actually use their fingernails to do the circumcising, like this way you would, maybe snap, if you're like trying to cut your kid's fingernails, you bite it or whatever. They'd use fingernails and they'd suck the blood, which is pretty gross, and like, fucking STDs would be transmitted via that.
These seem like extreme acts of sexual violence to you. That is because they are, and they have real consequences. Here we have a baby who has contracted herpes after a mohel has performed mitzitza on him. Now this baby is effectively brain dead for the rest of his life because this mohel was satisfying an ancient act of rabbinic revenge. This article is from 2017, guys. This is not ancient history.
This was all interesting to me
because I've always seen a relationship between circumcision and gender affirmation surgery.
Although John Money was pretty good at manipulating social anxieties to his own ends, even without this talent and fraud, as far as the broader society was concerned, intersex babies were, let's say, not a nice neighborhood, and Dr. John Money was an exciting new developer. Using progressive rhetoric, he pioneered a new form of neoliberal eugenics as he set about gentrifying a newly discovered population for the capitalist patriarchy.
In the name, affirmation, it shows that these are both religious processes. They're a form of ritual cutting where we agree socially, after this certain type of cutting, then they're transformed from like this type of person to this type of person. But that's like a social agreement. There's no actual biology to any of that. The purpose of doing it is the ritual of doing it. And I've also recently found sources that talk about the connection between class society and human sacrifice, which I'd never really thought about before. So this is from the Washington Post, and it says the quote, darker link, end quote, between ancient human sacrifice and our modern world. And basically it talks about the role that human sacrifice has played. And one of the things it says is that one of the main forms of early human sacrifice was to be buried, the same way like slaves in Egypt would get buried along with the king or whatever. So that shows a direct correlation between human sacrifice and class society, the idea of like people as property. That once the person who owned you was done owning you, you stopped existing. And also that this played a role in stratifying society, that the more human sacrifice you had, the more it divided the society into classes.
So, the story begins 12,000 years ago. Sigmund Freud surmised that circumcision started as a step down from child sacrifice. So instead of sacrificing the child, you would just sacrifice an essential part of him, his genitals. Now these genital blood sacrifices eventually lessened until just parts of his genitals were sacrificed, his foreskin. Now, many people erroneously believe, if you can believe it, many people erroneously believe something, but many people erroneously believe that circumcision started in the Old Testament, the Jewish holy book. Actually, Judaism adopted circumcision from tribes circumcising in the area. But if we take a look at the Holy Covenant in Genesis, we can see what it has to say. Every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised. Whether born or bought with your money, they must be circumcised.
And the 8th and final rule. If this is your first night at Fight Club, you have to fight.
Any uncircumcised male will be cut off from his people. Now, a couple things to notice here. Every baby must be circumcised, and slaves too, because that was cool at the time. And if you weren't, you were cut off from your people, which was tantamount to a death sentence in ancient times. Now, Leonard Glick, who is a Jewish man with a medical degree and a PhD in cultural anthropology with a specialty in genital cutting,
We gotta get his balls.
It's useless to fight. It's really a powerful gesture, Mr. Durden.
assures me that this is not even the original covenant. It was appended to the Bible in 500 BC for two reasons. Now, the first reason is the child is circumcised when he is a baby, so he has absolutely no choice in the matter. This forever forces him to look Jewish. Now, this promotes tribal cohesiveness, a primary objective of all tribal leaders, as they have a vested interest to maintain the social order of the tribe as they enjoy their status at the top of it. Now, the second reason is a little more interesting and plays to the underlying psychology behind genital cutting cultures. But let's use a modern day example: fraternity hazing.
Right. If the applicant is young, tell him he's too young. Old, too old, fat, too fat.
Don't you look at me. Do you think you're ever getting in this house? You're never getting in this fucking house. Never. Get the fuck off my porch. Get off the porch!
Fraternity hazing.
This is the second in my series of videos on modes of production. In the first one, I dealt with the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to agriculture, or to horticulture at least. In the second one, I'm dealing with the beginnings of the transition to class society and the rise of patriarchy. Now, according to historical materialism, there's a relationship between economic surplus and class.
The Hovertrack home Exer bike, or the Yohanneshav sofa with the string green stripe pattern, even the Rizlampa wire lamps of environmentally friendly unbleached paper. I'd flip through catalogs and wonder, what kind of dining set defines me as a person?
A precondition for the formation of classes in a society is that there's got to be a food surplus. But this is not enough by itself to create classes. A food surplus by itself might just extend the division of labour, allow some people to specialise in non-agricultural work, some of them to be potters, some to be smiths, etc. And a society with farmers, smiths and potters is not as such a class society, even if the trades become hereditary, since the relationship between the trades would still be one of equals. There wouldn't be any exploitation at that point. Class formation requires more than this. It requires that at least part of the food surplus goes to support a group of people who are no longer engaged in physical production. And this non-productive status has to be something that is inherited and passed down through the generations. Now, in addition to consuming more food, the upper classes had a disproportionate share of other goods: clothes, jewellery, utensils, ornaments, etc. So the surplus they consume is not just a food surplus, it's a general surplus. It's a surplus of the general labour product. And food surplus is just a precondition for this general surplus existing. Because if there wasn't a food surplus, there'd be no food for craftsmen. And if only enough cloth was produced to clothe the working population, then the rulers would go naked. If emperors have got clothes, there must be a food surplus. If kings are shodden, there must be a leather surplus. So that surplus moves beyond just being a matter of food and becomes a surplus of other products as well. One can look at this diagrammatically. Start off with a subsistence food economy where everyone grows the food they need themselves. The formation of a food surplus starts to allow craft workers, and as the food surplus gets bigger, you can have more craft surplus, more craft workers, and some of the food is going to the craft workers. Some of the food now goes to a non-labouring class, and they then consume part of the output of the craft workers. But that by itself isn't enough. Lots of things are needed. A class society requires a surplus, but the reverse isn't necessarily the case. A food surplus doesn't necessitate an exploiting class. To do that, you need other misfortunes. You need war, patriarchy, and religion. The sequence is population expands and uses up free land. You then get conflict over resources, and this gives rise to the warrior role. In small communities, this means raiding, raping, and capturing women. From this arises the patriarchy and the subordination of women, and from it also arises the capture of men to work as slaves, so that you get the transition from an initially egalitarian society to a patriarchal slave economy as the next stage. Now, there are laws of statistics behind this, and it's to do with how community size affects its reproduction. You have to realise that in any community, the basic reproductive resource are the young women in the community. The rest of the community doesn't contribute to its reproductive capacity. And in small communities, typical of the stage when some agriculture or horticulture exists, but not enough of the protein sources are coming from that. There's still some hunting for protein, and hunting tends to maintain a low population density, so that these agricultural settlements are widely separated and relatively small in number. Under these circumstances, the number of young women in a community fluctuates for statistical reasons. I've drawn some graphs here of, this is the expected number of girls in the next generation if you have a community of 20 families. I'm taking the number of women in the previous generation as the number of families. This is the probability distribution if you have 8 families, and basically this is a cumulative binomial distribution. I'm assuming that each woman has 2 children surviving to adulthood. Now, what these graphs tell you is if you project up, you can see what the probability of a shortfall is. So suppose we take a community of 8 families. They would end up with fewer than 6 young women in the next generation about a quarter of the time. But a shortfall of 4 women in this small community imply, that is to say, a ratio of 6 women to 10 men in the next generation, implies a shrinkage of the population by a quarter, which would threaten the survival of the community. So the actual survival of these small communities requires some mechanism to exist whereby women can be brought into that village. Communities with randomly low numbers of girls will have a strong pressure to get girls to migrate from neighbouring communities for them to survive. And we know historically this took 2 forms. The first was rape or capture of women, with the word rape in its original Latin sense meaning seizure, and the other was the purchase of brides in exchange for cattle. That, of course, it wasn't possible in the areas where cattle hadn't been domesticated. The net effect of this, either of those mechanisms, is to impose a transition from matrilocality, which was characteristic of hunting and gathering societies and the first stages of the Neolithic transition, to patrilocal societies, where successive generations live in the household of the male ancestor. Now, if we take the case of capture, the captured brides are going to be initially subordinate to the matriarch or mother-in-law, and then become subordinate to their husband. They're subordinate to the matriarch because they're not her daughters, they've been brought in by the sons of the village. And this undermines the general principle of equality of the sexes in the society. And the principle of capture also undermines equality within the community, because the captured wives are a subordinate group, and as such it prepares the cultural conditions for the capture of slaves. Now, if instead of the wives coming in by warlike capture, there is an exchange of cattle between the communities, that the village which gives up part of its reproductive potential is compensated by the receipt of cattle. What happens then is that the community that buys brides in exchange for cattle enters into a contract to the effect that the children of the bride that comes into the community will be members of her new tribe, not her original tribe. That has to be the case because that is the motivation for bringing in the brides. And this undermines matrilineal descent, since those children are no longer the children of her own mother's tribe. They become children of a tribe different from their mother, or lineage group different from their mother. At the same time, the actual purchase of women provides the general cultural background for the purchase of slaves, and it establishes the idea that people can be property.
A times B times C equals X. If X is less than the cost of a recall, we don't do one.
And it establishes the practice of, for instance, blood money. Compensation of one tribe for another in terms of cattle if one person is killed. So what we see here is a contradiction. The initially egalitarian matrilineal society, once it transitions to settled agriculture, generates internal contradictions that nullify its initial conditions of existence. And this is a general feature of the transitions between social forms. The combination of the society and its mode of existence in the environment generates in time contradictions which lead to the abolition of that social form. Now, how can it be resolved? The basic contradiction associated with small matrilineal communities could have been solved two ways. They could have become more exclusively agricultural or piscatorial whilst growing in size, so that it's possible to form big matrilineal or even matriarchal communities that don't suffer from this frequent random shortages of women of childbearing age. Larger communities like Catalhoyuk in Anatolia would not have suffered from these fluctuations in sex numbers, and this may be a reason why they were able to maintain an apparently egalitarian matriarchal structure for many thousands of years. The alternative path is to move towards a patrilineal and subsequently patriarchal form of family and clan structure. And we know empirically that in most cases, path 2 was more common. Now, at the same time as patriarchy and hierarchy and domestic slavery were developing, you get the rise of vengeful gods, belief in vengeful gods. And the early stages of class society are marked by the most brutal forms of religion, with human sacrifice as the most terror-inducing form of religion. Studies in a paper in Nature I'm citing, a statistical study of 93 different types of human cultures from anthropological records showed that 43% of these cultures carried out human sacrifice. Now, only a quarter of the egalitarian societies carried out human sacrifice, whereas 67% of the highly stratified societies carried out human sacrifice.
I was a recall coordinator. My job was to apply the formula.
Here's where the infant went through the windshield. 3 points.
A new car built by my company leaves somewhere traveling at 60 miles per hour. The rear differential locks up. The car crashes and burns with everyone trapped inside. Now, take the number of vehicles in the field, A, multiply it by the probable rate of failure, B, then multiply the result by the average out-of-court settlement, C. A times B times C equals X. If X is less than the cost of a recall, we don't do one.
Are there a lot of these kinds of accidents?
You wouldn't believe.
And it establishes the idea that people can be property.
Whatever we do to survive creates culture. The other side, what do you do when you've got these radical ideas? You maybe even had, a Marxist professor or two, and you got all these ideas and you see movements happening in different parts of the world. You want to be part of it, but you also want a job because you just spent a lot of time in school. In the US, a lot of what happens is radicals get a job in a nonprofit. And that because it's close to doing what we know is necessary. It's organizing, right? It's organizing. You're in a city often, or you're working with people that need some help of some sort. but there's large parameters put around what you need to do. So, because someone's funding it, and there's parameters about what can be said and what campaigns can be gotten into. So, for instance, now we have radicals very involved in organizations that are trying to stop the violence. Stop the violence meaning not the violence going on in Afghanistan, but stop the violence that's happening in the streets, the violence that happens among the working class. So they say stop the violence. And then what are the programs? I can agree with that. We need to stop that violence. What are the programs that are usually put forward by these nonprofits? Some of them staffed with radicals that are versed in some sort of class analysis. Are they putting forward a class line? Well, what they offer up often is we should teach people how to speak to each other nicer. We should have meetings with people and have kids play chess, because they play chess or they have a place to play basketball, which both are things that I think we should all be able to play chess and play basketball and watch movies and all of those things. I think that's part of life. But the idea is that if you do that, then they'll stop being violent. Why would that stop them from being violent? Why? Because the thing that's being put out by many of these organizations is that the violence is an outgrowth of an inferior moral code. The violence is an outgrowth of bad parenting. There's not a father in the house. The violence is an outgrowth of people being too macho, right? And there's whole theories that are put forward about this to back it up, because now you've got a job in it. You better make a good argument for it. And it confuses a lot of people. However, a class line about it will tell you that capitalism must have unemployment in order to work. If there was full unemployment under capitalism, then workers could demand whatever wage they wanted without even going on strike. Because the boss couldn't say, you're fired, I'm going to replace you. There's nobody to replace you. It's full employment. So unemployment is necessary to keep wages low. Wall Street Journal, all those financial newspapers will start worrying out loud when unemployment starts going down low. So what happens when you're unemployed? Most likely unemployed people want to eat too. So they're going to figure out a way to eat. And that means, in the United States, that means illegal business. And as we know, all business regulates itself. How does it regulate itself? All business regulates itself through violence. If it's legal business, it regulates itself through violence. That violent force is called the police. You can't walk out of a grocery store pushing a cart of groceries and not paying, because you're going to be met with that violent force. Now, maybe that violent force will meet you and they won't beat you down, depending on what you look like, what their mood is, what they ate for breakfast. You may not get roughed up. But at the very least, even if they kiss you on the forehead, they're definitely bringing those groceries back to the store. So that's the violent force that's needed for businesses to exist, right? That's the violent force that's necessary. Now, illegal business, they don't have it so easy. How do they regulate themselves? They do it themselves, right? Because they can't go to court and say, Your Honor, I bought a whole key of cocaine from him, and clearly it was mixed with 85% baking soda. I demand restitution. You can't do that. You can't go to the zoning commission and say, we gotta change these permits because this place should be zoned just for 2 dope dealers on this corner, and clearly 5 is too many, and I'd like to see what I can do about that. It's regulated through violence. It's regulated through violence, and whatever we do to survive creates culture. if you have a fishing village, there's going to be a bunch of fishing songs. However, nonprofits and cultural pundits will tell you that maybe if you went to a fishing village and made songs about planting seeds, that maybe it would change from a fishing village to an agricultural community. But no, fishing villages create fishing songs, not the other way around. So a culture is developed out of what we do to survive. And you know what? Revolutionaries know this. It's just not in fashion to say it. And it's terrible because it's a really easy thing to talk about. Like, there's so many interviews where, public leaders are like, what are we going to do about the violence in our communities? And if I'm ever there, I say, hey, how about we support organizing the fast food workers and getting $16 an hour? And like, then there's silence. Like, but that doesn't mean funding the police, right? So all of these, we've had a number of ex-revolutionaries in Oakland that are in the city council or a mayor. We had, one of the first people that declared themselves a socialist in Congress, Ron Dellums, whose grandfather was one of the organizers of the first black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Ron Dellums declared himself a socialist. He came back and was the mayor of Oakland, and that was his answer too. It was more police, but maybe more polite police, right? So we get into these crazy, sidetrack arguments based on our unwillingness to work around organizing labor in a radical way, right? A lot of the answers, even beyond making a revolution, just changing things a little bit, come with having that part organized. I talk about the $16 an hour for fast food workers. Anybody that I know that has sold dope clearly makes less than $12 an hour and would gladly take a job that paid that much instead of doing that, right? So these are short-term, but even the organizing for that isn't a long-term solution to that because, as we know, everybody can't be employed, right? We know what the long-term solution is, and that's why we're here. However, to the extent that we need to organize reforms in order to build a revolutionary movement, these are the reform struggles that we're hiding away from. I mean, imagine if the campaign to get rid of a racist cop could call on the local industry to shut down until that cop was fired. It'd be much better than having people picketing around in a circle in front of the police station. Because what happens is the community says, that's never gonna work. And unfortunately, they're right. Like, I've been involved in many police brutality campaigns. And unless we have a base of power to shut things down, what's gonna happen is what's happened in every one of them that I've been in. Even when there's video of a cop having someone laid on the ground and shooting them in the back. That's the worst that happened, and because it was on video and all over YouTube, the cop got 10 months in jail, and that was it, right? And that's the most success we've ever had. All the other ones, the cop gets fired, quote unquote, but what that means is moved to another precinct, another city, and where he gets pats on the back because he's, in their eyes, a badass, and he gets a raise, right? That cop that got 10 months in jail is suing to get his back pay now, and probably will get it, right? So the point is this: whatever we do to survive creates culture. If you have a fishing village, there's going to be a bunch of fishing songs.
But basically, it's all about the like Tyler's kiss scene where Tyler kisses the back of the guy's hand and puts whatever chemical on it to make it burn.
Now, ancient peoples found their clothes got cleaner when they washed them at a certain point in the river. You know why?
No.
Because human sacrifices were once made on the hills above this river. Bodies burned, water seeped through the wood and ashes to create lye. This is lye, the crucial ingredient. Once it mixed with the melted fat of the bodies, a thick white soapy discharge crept into the river. Answer your hand.
What is this?
This is a chemical burn. It will hurt more than you've ever been burned, and you will have a scar.
What are you doing?
Stay with the pain. Don't shut this out.
No, no.
I'm sure other people have noticed this. When he first gets his hand burnt, he's saying, I'm going to go to my cave, I'm going to find my power animal.
It's right here.
I'm going to my cave. I'm going to my cave. I'm going to find my power animal.
I think that's a reference to like pre-agricultural religions, and
I think the concept of a cave here is also meant to be reminiscent of hunter-gatherer society, of worshipping nature religions, and then Tyler's self-help group is the kind of authoritarian Abrahamic tradition.
No! Don't deal with it the way those dead people do.
He's basically like saying, oh, you can run back to God if you want and try and pour water over it, but that's just going to make it worse. Or you can have access to this special knowledge that I have, essentially, and that will fix your hand.
Listen! You can run water over your hand to make it worse, or look at me! Or you can use vinegar to neutralize the burn.
So, I know it might seem like at this point I am really going out on a limb to make the argument that he's talking about agriculture and civilization. But he does literally call soap the yardstick of civilization. Also, there have been 2 comic book sequels written to Fight Club, which I know because I'm that big of a nerd. And this connection between the devil and Tyler and civilization is made even stronger. These are basically like Money and the Cost of Gender type cartoon, but in Fight Club comic. So this first page is from issue 9 of Fight Club 2, and it's basically the narrator and Marla in the Garden of Eden with Tyler as the snake. So
you can run water over your hand to make it worse, or look at me! Or you can use vinegar to neutralize the burn.
That makes it pretty explicit, and if that isn't enough, in issue 8 of Fight Club 3, there are these 2 panels where a severed head explains what's going to happen to people that survive basically this next genocidal revolution. So, because I can totally see it from other people's perspective of like, oh yeah, you're obsessed with Fight Club. Of course you want Fight Club to be saying what you think it's saying.
Sort of science and progress. Oh yeah.
Look at your hand. The first soap was made from the ashes of heroes, like the first monkey shot into space. Without pain, without sacrifice, we would have nothing.
And so he's now, in a lot of the other parts of the movie, he's advocating this like, oh, I want to go back to hunter-gatherer living, which is seen as valuable because it's authentic and real and in the present, whereas everything in this guy's life is distant and fake and in like, you know, a copy of a copy of a copy. But at this point, he really is kind of like making the fascist kind of progress argument, and it's all based off of, he's like, it's all about human sacrifice. He's like, this is where soap comes from.
Soap. The yardstick of civilization.
Literal human sacrifices, and that's why we need to continue to do this. And in a sense, the burning of the back of his hand is kind of like a circumcision, in that it's like, he's like, this will hurt worse than you've ever been hurt before, and it'll leave a scar.
To wrap up censored fact number 1, it is irrefutably true that rabbis designed and implemented circumcision to damage Jewish children's sexuality. Now, this is a fact. It is an irrefutable fact. There are tombs of evidence to support this. Yes, it was done to mark us like cattle and to emasculate us like slaves, and as an act of submission to your father, but to damage our sexuality in the most fundamental of ways for life was also a primary objective.
What is that? It's nothing. Don't worry about
Oh
it.
my God. Who did this?
A person.
Guy or girl?
What do you care if it's a guy or a girl?
What do you care if I ask?
It's none of your business. Leave me
You're afraid
alone.
to say.
I am not afraid to say, let me go.
No!
And it's in keeping with the general, like, hazing type way that Project Mayhem and Tyler recruit people, where there's a sense that people have when they have sacrificed that whatever they did must have been worth it because they sacrificed for it. So people will be less likely to leave something they've sacrificed to get into, even if it's just as without merit as, you know, something that's been given to them for free.
So there's a whole lot to digest there, and, you know, I'm sure lots of things people agree and disagree with. But I thought it would be valuable because
it's a new way into, like, broaching the topic of what is appropriate cosmetic surgery.
Like, I don't have strong views about UBI or what he calls the freedom dividend, $1,000 a month. I don't know what I think about that. He's like against circumcision. He has like all these views about things.
Yeah.
I don't really know if I agree with him on most of his things.
Against circumcision, you don't agree with that?
No.
Really?
Yeah. No,
You're cutting baby dicks?
I'm not like passionate about that. Are you?
Yeah, people lose their dicks. A lot of kids every year. Do you know children die from that?
They
Children
lose their
die.
dicks?
Yes, all the time. It's very common.
Really?
Yes. Like multiple children per year lose their penis from an unnecessary, antiquated operation where you cut off their dicks to make it look different.
What did you think was gonna happen?
Okay.
You're cutting skin off of their dick, and they wind up getting infected, and they lose their dicks. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough time where you go, this should never happen.
He's a man, and he's dead now because of us, all right? Do you understand that?
This is a completely unnecessary operation. Robert Baker
is this
estimates
like
229 deaths per year from circumcision in the United States. Bollinger estimates that approximately 119 infant boys die from circumcision-related each year in the U.S., 1.3% of all male neonatal deaths from all causes. There are several case reports of death in the medical literature. Yeah. It's not simple. You're cutting skin. Skin is an organ. You have an unnecessary, and I'm circumcised. You have an unnecessary operation that you're doing to an infant, and it's decorative.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a joke about it.
And you don't buy any of the studies about how it prevents STDs and
No, I don't. Wash your dick.
I cannot believe we're talking about this.
We should be talking about it. Well, why not? Kids are dying. Like, it's like, how many of them have to die before we say this is a ancient, ridiculous ritual? It doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
I've seen the arguments for and against, like that it prevents STDs. Like, look, you know what prevents STDs? Condoms and abstinence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what prevents STDs, and in some cases, vaccinations. This is what prevents STDs. This circumcision is ridiculous. It doesn't even make any sense.
Okay, cannot believe I stumbled into this because I was talking about Andrew Yang.
You fucked up.
I guess I did. I didn't know this was like a strongly you're an intactivist. Is that what it's called?
Whatever. Intactivist, that's a good way to put it. I've never heard that expression, but that's exactly what I am. Yeah, don't cut baby dicks. It's real simple. When you say it that way, people go, yeah, that sounds gross. When you say, oh, circumcision, like, oh, what a wonderful ritual, and it's symbolic of your journey until, get the fuck out of here. You're cutting baby dicks. It doesn't make any sense.
So I just wanted to do a little wrap up and address a few issues. One of the issues is what they bring up in the Joe Rogan interview about STIs. That's basically untrue. It's a myth. I don't remember exactly how, but yeah, watch the Eric Clopper thing. I remember he specifically shows a quote from the Australian medical whatever, and it's saying that the document that the American Association of Pediatrics, I think it is, points to justify circumcision is an embarrassment. So it's the type of response that you would expect to get if the rest of the world was sane and America had proposed gender identity. There'd be all these people going, this is crazy, like, you can do it, I guess, if you want, but there's no medical justification for this. So there was that. On the issue of cleanliness, I guess I'll say I have a friend who has a foreskin, And they turned out to be every uncircumcised kid's parents' nightmare, in that this friend was obviously taught how to clean their dick, but at some point they must have just gotten, I don't know, uninspired or whatever, and it must have been, I can't fathom how long it was that they went without cleaning it. And all that happened was it got a bit manky and tender. That was the worst, and that was like dedicated. That was the equivalent of like, we're going to take this foreskin for a road test. Put it through its paces, see what it can handle. So don't worry about that shit. Also on the STI things, it made me wonder, like, obviously no one likes condoms, but there seems to be a particular, I don't know, some people are like really anti-condom, and it made me think that maybe because of the reduced, maybe it's in part because of the reduced sensation. Like essentially when you circumcise a boy, you're like, for lack of more poetic terminology, you're like cutting the eyelid off their dick. So you would imagine an eye that had just been exposed to the elements and had all sorts of shit and whatever, and it just had to, it could never shut. It just had to take all those hits on the chin. Like, it would be probably a less sensitive eye. And that's basically what happens here, I think. So, yeah, I don't know. That's just a pet theory of mine. And what's the last thing? Oh, yeah. People who don't know, Dr. John Money was basically the systems expert on gender identity in the 50s. For a long period, he was a academic and a doctor. And he was the first American doctor to kind of like to specialize in gender identity, I guess, and really make it a thing. And so for a long time, he was circumcising, essentially. He was doing gender reassignment surgery or whatever, but it was basically like ritual cutting. And he was doing it on intersex babies. And that was seen as permissible because essentially intersex babies were seen as like already ruined. So you couldn't do anything that would be worse than that, was, you know, the logic of the society at the time. And so for a long time, John Money was restricted to intersex kids. But what allowed him to make the transition from intersex children to the rest of the population was that a child lost their penis during a circumcision. And so that gave this creepy doctor a way to intervene and, in a large part, create the gender regime that we see today.
A thick white soapy discharge crept into the river.
And so for that reason, I think, yeah, it's important to consider. Anyway, been talking about this for a while. Hope you liked it. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, clean your foreskin.
He has like all these views about things.
Yeah.
I don't really know if I agree with him on most of his things. They
Children
lose their
die.
dicks?
Yes.